Now we're applying all these ideas to these problems. So what is our period? Our period is going to be our distance that it takes to repeat along the x-axis. Our period here is 8, and we can see that either between 0 and 8 or 4 and 12. So that means b periods equals 2 pi. B is 2 pi over 8 or pi over 4. C, well, we're going to deal with that last. A is going to be the distance between the middle and to the top, or middle to the bottom. In other words, that's going to be 5 minus 1 divided by 2, because we're going to take that distance, 5 minus 1, and cut it in half. So that gives us 4 over 2, or 2. Now we need to find what is our vertical shift. In other words, what is our middle line? Our vertical shift will be d is 5 plus 1 divided by 2. D will be the average of them. Our middle line will be the average, the midline. That'll be 3. So now we have A, B, D, but we don't have C. Well, C is going to depend if it's a sine or a cosine graph. So which one is easier right now? You should recognize right away that cosine is the easiest one since it starts at our high. So if it's cosine, then C is 0. That would be the easiest way to do it. So that equation would be y equals, we have our A, 2 cosine of pi over 4. There is no horizontal shift, x, and then we'll add 3. Now, what would happen if I said, hey, I want to start it down here instead? Well, what would that be? That would be a C of 4, but then if C is 4, that would make A be negative 2. So this would be y equals negative 2 cosine of pi over 4 times x minus 4, because we're shifting 4 right, plus 3. I just want to show that there's multiple different answers here. And then if we're dealing with the sine, we need to say, okay, where does sine start? We can start sine wherever you want. It starts at the middle line. We can draw that middle line here. So we could either start it at this spot or this. So let's assume we're going to start at this first one. What is that point? Well, the high is at 0 and the low is at 4. So when it hits the middle, it's going to be the average of those. That'll be 2. So C will be 2. But if C is 2, where does sine normally go? From our midline, it goes up. But this one goes down. So that means A is negative 2. So y equals negative 2 sine of, we still have our B is the same, pi over 4. We're going to shift it 2 units right. And our D has to be the same as well. What if we said, oh, I don't want to go down first. I want to go and do a normal sine graph, so I want to start it right here. What is that value? Well, that's going to be halfway between the 4 and the 8, so that'll be 6. So if C is 6, that would give us A is going to be positive because it's going up. Sine of pi over 4 times x minus 6, all of that plus 3. All right, the next one. We're just going to do the same thing each time. When we look at this, we can start with the period. We can look at A. It doesn't really matter. The period in this case would be, so it's at a low at negative 3, and it gets at a low at 7 again. So the period is going to be 10. And so that means B times 10 is 2 pi, and 2 pi over 10 is pi over 5. Now, let's see what A is. A is going to, what did we do before? We're going to take our high minus the low, the max minus the min. Recall that. We dealt with that in previous chapters. So 2 minus negative 1 divided by 2. So that'll be 3 halves. D is our midline, our midpoint, basically, and the line going across at y equals that. So that'll be the average of those two. 2 plus negative 1 divided by 2, which is 1/2. And we can draw that one in here. So note, this isn't going to start nicely for sine graph, but that's not a problem. We can figure it out. Cosine's going to be easier again in this problem. If it's cosine, what is C? Well, we can look here and say, C, the high point is at 2, so C is 2. And that would give us y equals our A, 3 halves cosine pi over 5 times the quantity of x minus 2. All of that plus 1/2. Now we need to figure it out for sine. Let's keep sine positive, so we want to have it from the midline going up. So we need to find what is that value. Well, I did it one way over here by finding the average, and I've shown this other one. We know that the time it takes to go from, or the distance horizontal, from low to mid to high to mid to low, how many intervals are there? 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's 1/4 of the period. So 1/4 of the period is 1/4 of 10, which is 5/2 or 2.5. So that means if I take -3 and I say plus 5/2, that'll give me here, or I can say 2 minus 5/2. Either way, if I say 2 minus 5/2, or I could say -3 plus 5/2, either way you get -1/2. And that's what C is for sine. So we have y equals, again, most of the stuff will be the same. The a value, we're going up, it's positive. Pi over 5 times the quantity of x plus 1/2, and then we have plus 1/2 on the outside. And just like the previous one, we could write multiple equations for it, but we're just going to do one each. Next one is just another practice of it. So we can say a is 3 minus -1, max minus min, over 2. So that's 4 over 2, which is 2. We can go right away to D is the midpoint, 3 plus -1 over 2. So that's going to be at 1. So we'll have something that looks like this. Now, when we're looking at this one, it looks like that we can treat it again however you want in terms of shifting. Oh, did I forget something? I forgot the period on this one. What is the period? The time it takes, the distance it takes to go from low to the low again, or the high to the high, is going to be pi. So the period is pi. So we have pi times b equals 2 pi. B is 2. Now we need to find if it's sine or cosine. So if it is, let's say, cosine, then we could say C is pi over 2, because there's a high point. And that equation would be y equals 2 times the cosine of 2, because that's our b value, times x minus pi over 2, and that plus 1. Now, we could have done this equation a little earlier as well, because there is no horizontal shift on here. So what if C was 0? That would mean A is -2. So this would be y equals -2 cosine of 2x plus 1. So just a little bit simpler. And then what if we're dealing with the sine graph? We're going to have to figure out what is that value. Well, this one's not too bad, because it's going to be the midpoint between 0 and pi over 2, or if I did the previous method I did, 1/4 of the period would be pi over 4. Either way, we get the same thing. C would be pi over 4. So that equation would be y equals 2 sine b is 2 times x minus pi over 4, and then that plus 1. Now let's take a look at this graph. Now, I like to change this around and say -4 cosine of x minus pi, and then take that and add 3. So what is this telling me? I like to do these in stages as well. Let's deal with the multiplication at first, but there's no coefficient here of the x, so that means our period is 2 pi. Our amplitude is 4. Our vertical shift is 3, and so this is going to be 3 up. And our C is pi, which is going to be pi right. So when we're doing this, if we're just dealing with the multiplication part, what that's going to do is it says our normal cosine starts like this, and this value would be 4 and -4, but then it's flipped over because that's a -4 coefficient. This graph is going to be shifted pi units right and 3 units up. So let's go 3 here, and then from there we're going to go 4 up. 1, 2, 3, 4, and so that will be at 7, 3, and then it'll be down here at -1, and we'll go pi units right. I'll go in increments of pi over 2, so there's pi, so it's starting there. And what I can do is draw my normal cosine graph from here. It's going to be going up, and then I'll label the values. And this is, now this was pi, so this would have to be 3 pi, and then in the middle we're saying that this is 2 pi, and that point would be what would be halfway in between there, 3 pi over 2, and then over here would be 5 pi over 2. And we could also say that 1/4 of the period is 2 pi over 4, or pi over 2. So once we have our starting point, we can just add pi over 2 each time to go from low, mid, high, mid, low. And then from here, we can just sketch the rest of this. Go back to the axis. So pi over 2, we're going to be at the mid again, and then it'll be at the high. And I want to see always one complete period labeled, and that's looking pretty good there.